Hi. Could you tell me your name for this?
My name is Kenneth Hoyle.
And you were alive in
I was born on the 21st of January 1929, so I'm 84 now.
Ah, that's good. I'm just gonna ask, what was wartime Britain like in general?
Well, it varied a lot from town to town. In this town, whilst we were very militarised in that we had a large contingent of the British Army here, the Royal Signals here, in the main, we saw very little of it. We had a good civil defence service. My father, for example, as an air raid warden, was taken away from his own job at the outbreak of war to be a full-time air raid warden. And he used to do alternative days and nights. It was an air raid post that was in the bottom of a school, sandbagged and so on and so forth. I mean, and they did work, but I mean they did a lot of other work. For example, to fill in the time when they were doing nothing, my father made a fort for me. He also made a dragon. We were in a play for St George.
Really?
But as it went on, what did happen then? They brought out a series of a system of boxes, electronic boxes, which hung on a peg by the bottom of our stairs. I can almost hear it now. And it was called the Ripley system. And it used to forewarn the approach of enemy bombers, so that wardens necessarily needn't be always out on the streets all the time. They could stay there, so that when you got an amber alert, for example, they would probably start getting the kit ready. When they got a red alert, it was because enemy aircraft were approaching. In this town, we were often crossed by enemy aircraft who were on the way to Manchester and places like that. So we had in Huddersfield tremendous anti-aircraft batteries based all around from Bradley Lane right through to Sallandine Nook.
Okay.
And in fact, I can tell you that I was a student at Royds Hall Grammar School, as it was then, and every morning we used to, when it came to the lunch break, look for shrapnel. And one day we went down to the railway sidings, and we had heard that there'd been a lot down there, and when we got down there it took us a heck of a job to get back, and we were late into school, so we were publicly caned the following morning, which of course masters used to do. And I mean, it was very dangerous because a lot of the shrapnel still was quite hot, some of it was extremely jagged, but shrapnel was used like we used to swap comic cigarette cards and things like that, or marbles. It was, you know, the bigger the piece, the better for it. But it certainly interrupted life. What it did, in many cases, was bring a lot of the areas very closely together, because a lot of the women's organisations, when the men had been called up, would hold things like beetle drives and pea and pie suppers, which they'd, you know, get together to raise a few shilling. My father, for example, used to write letters from a lot of the people that he knew, and they had what they called a comforts fund at the New Inn at Bradford Road, which is a pub, where they used to raise money by darts contests and this, that, and this. So my father would write these letters to the various soldiers and send them maybe a 5-shilling post load or something like that, and did this throughout the war.
To get them to come to the pub?
Pardon?
To get them to come to the pub, what are the letters for?
The
letters are to get them to come to the pub.
No, the letters he would get them at home. They would at home, and then he would post them up wherever, because they weren't necessarily always people from the pub. There were other people. I mean, for example, my father worked when it was a fishmonger in the wholesale market, and we used to get quite a lot of fish. It was, I mean, people would queue up for fish, but obviously at home we used to get it. And one of the things that he promised to do, some of the lads who he'd worked with, who had been called up, he would be going around on the bike, taking a parcel of fish every so often to the house, just to help out with the ration.
How old were you during the war?
I was 11 when it started.
And when it finished,
I went on. I was 17 when 16 and a half actually when it finished.
What personal experiences did you bring from it?
Well, I was a Boy Scout for the time, and at school Training Corps, branch of the Air Training Corps, and Hoyle and Huddersfield College cooperated in that when you got into the 5th form you could go into the Air Training Corps, and of course it was kept on by the old boys squadron because people obviously went in. Now I played away a lot at school, and so consequently when I should have gone into the 5th form, I didn't. I went into the 4th form, and I decided to leave to join in my father's business. My ultimate aim was incidentally to become a police officer and go to Hendon, but I got time to kill before I could do that. And so in the ATC we visited various of the aerodromes. Acaster Malbis springs to mind. We would go maybe on the training, you know, things, jumping over hedges and things like that. And we would, every so often, about once a month, we would go up to I was our flight sergeant's house at Kirkburton, and behind it there was a rifle range. So we used to have the opportunity to fire what was then the standard issue, the 303 rifle.
Mm.
And one of my friends who was, when I was a choir boy, his father was a sergeant in the Home Guard who used to bring his equipment home, and we used to take pleasure in, once we'd been shown how to strip a Sten gun, strip a Bren gun, a rifle, so that in actual fact when I was duly called up to do my national service in the army, it became very easy because of course I'd done all the drills with the ATC, I'd done all this business with the armament, so life was comparatively easy. I mean, I finished up as being a marker. But it's rather strange this last fortnight, because whilst I did what was called the PTC Primary Training Corps, which was with the Duke of Wellington's at Hyroyd Well Barracks in Halifax, we had a tremendous snowfall in 1947, where we were then taken out in wagons and things out onto the Lancashire, near to the Lancashire borders we could get, to keep the road open between Halifax and Oldham, which were one of the main roads, and we were equipped with what were in effect trenching tools about 4 times the size of a tablespoon to dig through some of these 30-foot drifts and things. And so this last fortnight's been very reminiscent of that to me.
Did you own an Anderson shelter, or did your family own an Anderson shelter? And what was that like? We didn't have an Anderson shelter because we kept hens in the back garden, and we decided that it was better to have the hens than an Anderson shelter. But we did get one of the first Morrison shelters. That was the thing you had.
A Morrison shelter was a table, basically. It had mesh sides, a steel top, and it was sprung like a crisscross with some sort of metal.
So basically,
as a mattress. So we slept on the table, under the table. When the sirens went, we did, but we, like many other people, because nothing happened, it got very uncomfortable, and we didn't bother. They eventually got it taken out. But of course, certainly I had friends that had Anderson shelters. It's in fact one of them.
Did you ever go inside one?
Oh yes. They were invariably full of water at the bottom, incidentally. Unless you've got somebody that got some idea of putting drainage in, because but there was no doubt about it, they did save a lot of lives. I mean, they were basically corrugated and very, very difficult to assemble for the average person, to be perfectly honest. Many of them finished up with bunks in, little home from homes, with plenty of light and things like that, particularly in areas where bombing was prevalent, like Manchester, places like that, Leeds, Sheffield, many of them. I had a sister who lived in Sheffield, and in Leeds rather, and so I often went out there.
Oh, okay. What was the food like compared to nowadays? How accessible was it?
We always say that the people the youngsters who lived through the war years, with a shortage, if you like, of butter and meat and things like that, were considerably much fitter. And when I think about myself, that probably is quite true to that extent. There was a black market. There were British
kitchens where you could go and have a meal for 5 shillings. Restaurants couldn't charge more than 5 shillings. There was a tremendous black market in some of the bigger hotels in London, for example, where champagne and whatever you wanted could be got, because there could be, then there was a lot of money made by black marketeering, particularly from people, you know, who would maybe farmers or something like that. For my own part, a lot of my mother's relatives lived in a place called Elsica near Barnsley, a little village, and they kept pigs. And they, of course, we got to get a license to kill the pig, and a certain amount of it had to go to pig club members. And so I never remember being short of home-cooked bacon. It was always hung up in these Barnsley places, but I think I told you earlier, it became immune to what we called then a blind stew, still do. That because the meat ration was so small, it wasn't done on an ounce or a pound, it was done by a ration, shall we say 1 and twopence, I think it was, or something like that, part of which could be corned beef. Part of it had to be corned beef sometimes. And because the father or the working people of the house really needed the food, they would have the meat out of the stew and you would have the blind stew. Because, as I say, it probably put me off meat. But of chickens, for example, which are now an everyday part, they were an absolute luxury, and they were a luxury until well after the war, in actual fact. Chickens were something that, you know, certainly the poorer people didn't. Now, of course, it's a cheap meal.
Mm. Oh, okay. So what was entertainment like then? Were there any comedians or impressionists?
It was probably the best part, if you like, for the breeding of the various stars. They were virtually constant on the radio. People like Tommy Handley, George Roby. He was one going way back before the war. Tommy Handley was the most famous, of course. Arthur Askey and his partner, the Crazy Gang. And in fact, they became, many of them, and many of the stars that have turned out since the war, were recruited or joined ENSA, which was the entertainment section where people went out, like Vera Lynn, the Force's sweetheart, would go out to the various battle areas to entertain the troops. People like Bob Hope for the Americans did this, of course. Bing Crosby did it. So there always seemed to be a plethora of stars, and because, of course, there was no television. George Formby, for example, was a tremendous. Gracie Fields was. But she did become ostracised because she married an Italian, and he was a naturalised Italian man, General Monty Banks, funnily enough. But nevertheless, she did entertain, and by the sheer quality of her voice, I mean, she was widely loved by the forces. Yes, entertainment, I think, at that time was really at its height. We had forerunners of various programmes, In Town Tonight, for example, where I can remember the announcer used to say, and the roar of London's traffic stops, and there was all this traffic noise which suddenly stopped. And then you get topical news for London and places like that. And your Children's Hour, where you avidly listen to Children's Hour with Uncle Mac and all these sort of people. All the things that have developed to Blue Peter and things like that, all started, there's nothing new. It was always there.
I can understand that.
A tremendous amount of plays, for example, that were, because they were oral, and even game shows. People like Wilfred Pickles. Remember we were talking about game shows with prizes that might be a hand wringer or a chair or something like that. Nothing like the fantastic prizes that you get now, the thousands and thousands of pounds. But they were all good entertainment. There's no doubt about that. And let me just say one thing as well.
Okay.
I was a choir boy and eventually a choir man. And most of the churches round about had choirs, of course, mainly with boys. But in nearly every case, they were formed into concert parties that went out and do things. There were a number of them that were quite famous in Huddersfield, entertaining in hospitals and doing that. So life, to me, always seemed extremely packed. You never had time to be bored.
Okay. That's, do you remember what the Prime Minister was like Churchill.
Do I remember?
Churchill. Winston
Yeah,
Churchill.
very well. As I say, as a matter of fact, my father, even though he was working class, they had been dedicated Conservatives. He, in fact, acted as agent for Alderman J.P. Nicholl, who was an alderman in the town, for his sundry elections every 4 years. So I was brought up, if you like, a Conservative, and in fact, ultimately became the youngest Conservative councillor in Huddersfield for a seat that had never been anything but Labour or Liberal before that. Certainly remember Churchill, certainly had the pleasure of both seeing him and hearing him speak live when he came to St George's Square to support Lady Violet Bonham Carter.
Like? What was his speech like?
Well, it was the usual. It was an election speech, not a wartime speech. But of course, you see, he was using his wartime popularity to get the crowd. Tremendous crowds down there. Somebody was supposedly...
The crowd loved him, basically.
Sorry?
The crowd enjoyed
he was stood on a farm cart, actually, a four-wheel cart. But Lady Violet Bonham Carter was a candidate for the Colne Valley, as it was then, and she was a Liberal. And of course, we had what they called national Liberals, who were Liberals allied to the Conservative Party, but she wasn't. There was a great outcry from his own people because he actually did this, and of course it did cause a bit of a furore because of course even though she was standing in the Colne Valley, he made the speech in St George's Square, which was obviously a massive place. He could make his voice heard to everybody around, and what it did result in was of course the chap who got elected in Huddersfield, as if you like, as a bit of a backlash for that, where we'd always had Liberals or national Liberals, was a chap called J.P.W. Mallaloo, who stood as an MP at the end of the war because he was in the Navy, but anybody who was fighting an election was immediately discharged from either the Army or the Navy. It was one good way of getting out. If you could fight a seat that you were going to lose, or at least you'd be back in the Bob Street. And and he dislodged the then National Liberal for Huddersfield, because they only had one MP in those days, which was a chap called William Mabane, who was quite a well-known man throughout our life. But I'd always been interested in politics, and of course politics were a great thing in those days. I mean, the meetings that you went to for the various candidates were tremendous places, packed, or if they were on soapboxes, as John Major did ultimately, that was the normal thing in those days, that candidates would go there, there'd be a lot of wit exchanged by members of the crowd heckling. And of course the election days itself, they were tremendously busy. I mean, not nowadays, you wouldn't know there are elections going on. Certainly people, you'd get 60-70% of the electorate voting anyway. Nowadays you're lucky if you get more, you get halfway. So.
Do you remember the American the president back then?
Yes, yeah, I suppose, because it always had a lot of politics in. I certainly remember, and of course the president in America at that time was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I've never forgotten his name, and his wife also was a great foreign ambassador. She was called Eleanor Roosevelt. He had been crippled, which wasn't widely known, by poliomyelitis. And there's somebody playing with the birds. And in actual fact, that it wasn't known that he sometimes really had to be propped up, that he was quite a cripple. And indeed, when he went to various of the big meetings that were held between Stalin, Roosevelt, Churchill, he often had to be stood up. He couldn't stand for so long. He was in a wheelchair. But of course, when he was in his own office, he'd got his legs under the desk. And he was the last president to serve more than 2 terms. He saw America through the Depression, and of course, he was a bit of a great Anglophile. He did some very brave things by, for example, very much against the will of his Congress and his Senate, he sold us 50, or let us have 50, of obsolete, well they were out of date, destroyers, which bolstered our fleet in 1941, or just at the end of 1940, and of course introduced lease lend, which was a good thing. It meant that we could have this, that and the other, whether it be food, munitions or anything else, on a hire purchase basis, that we would pay for it at the end of the war, and of course did pay for it at the end of the war, and many other places did, because they, of course, they had everything literally there. Rationing was, I mean, whilst they had rationing, it was nothing like our rationing, because that country at that time was more or less self-supporting, whether it be from cotton or anything else. I mean, all those industries that had long gone, coal and things like that, it was virtually a self-supporting nation, but naturally it would be. A, because it had got a great access, of course, no real borders to Canada in the north, and of course to South America in the south, where literally everything was there. It was one half of the world, if you like.
One of the major decisions that Roosevelt made was the dropping of the atom bomb on Japan to end the war completely.
No, that's not true. It was Truman who made the dropping it.
Well, the American decision.
President Roosevelt died in office.
Yes.
President Roosevelt died before the end of the European War.
Yeah. Okay.
If memory serves me right, I think it was either in the November or something like that. I think 1944.
Did you agree with the dropping of the bomb back then?
Back then, yes, everybody did, because it ended the war. I mean, nobody really knew what the end results would be, or indeed, it was so decided by the then United Nations that it would only be the superpowers, really ourselves and the Americans and the French, who would really have the secrets of the atom bomb. Of course, they've been divulged by various people until Russia and, of course, places like Vietnam or North Korea now can be threatening the world by it. The idea being, of course, that if you've got a weapon big enough to destroy a country, that people will listen to you, as the Japanese had to do. Nowadays, when there's so many people with it, everybody's worried about having a nuclear war, which would be really total self-destruction.
Yeah. But now that you've had time to think about it and you know the effects of the bomb, do you still agree with it being dropped? Or should they have thought about it, you know?
I don't think we'd any alternative but to do that. It would have been, I think, a very long job to have captured or even made Japan subservient to us, because of course their culture was literally to carry on fighting until the death. I mean, people, their prisoners of wars, of course, were just looked down on it. It took years and years and years before that. I mean, there's one case where I think there were two men found many, many years after the war still in an island thinking the war was still going on, because they didn't know any better. I mean, their subsistence and the way they were treated was no better than the way they treated our own men. But our own men, of course, who were prisoners of wars, in their eyes were cowards. They should have been dead. That was their attitude, and it was their attitude to their own part. I mean, when the eventual surrender of Japan came by, many of their senior officers committed harikari because they could no longer live with it. Many industrialists did the same as well. It has become more modernised very quickly, of course.
What do you think the global effect the war has had globally on day-to-day life, society in general, and just the effects of it, really, I guess?
So, one of the things it has done, it's made the world a much smaller place. Of course, there are very few places that can't be reached within 2 or 3 days from wherever they are, which would, of course, it would have been weeks and weeks. So that's one of the things. I think the emancipation of women, insofar as it's gone, has been a great thing, and I think the many improvements that have been caused, if you like, by World War, to both the scientific side and the medical side, particularly on the surgery side, have all been boons. They've all been great. The big travesty of it is that every nation in the world seems to want power, and of course every nation in the world is, or every person working, living within this, have become greedy, and they've got so much more than they ever had, and more wants more. And there's a tremendous amount of greed throughout the world, in every country that you look at. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. And it's tragic that you often ask people like me, what was it like when you were young? When it was a leisurely life. We went out with the milk cart, we helped with the milk. For example, when I was at school, to help the family coffers, because my German mistress at school lived in the house that still lives on Bradford Road, the one just after that garage place, and I used to fill coal scuttles there, all the way up the 5 floors from the cellar, for a printer sum of 2 and 6pence a week, which went into their coffers, you see. And my mother could send me across to the butcher's with a shilling, and that shilling would bring a half a pound of lean beef back. You wouldn't have shin beef, you only wanted lean beef. So, yeah, things were different. We hadn't got things. I mean, I always remember, for example, being poor because everybody wanted roller skates, and my colleagues who came from middle class and upper middle class families would have roller skates with ball bearings in. Mine would come from Woolworths, and of course they never lasted very long. And yet, I personally, and many like me, would never have envisaged having a telephone, for example. Certainly would never have envisaged having a car, or even believed that you were going to go abroad, because it was being in the army, which sent me abroad, of course. When I crossed Europe 6 times by rail. The first time through a totally devastated world, if you like, where there were nothing but ruins, and we were there in rail trucks in the January, without windows in, going through to Italy, which took us 6 days to get into Austria. And because there was a strike in Italy, couldn't get through, and so I spent considerable time in Villach in Austria. And it broadened my mind, it opened my eyes that there were places apart from my own town. Because in those days, for example, if you lived in Huddersfield but you got a job in Leeds, you would remove. You would have to remove. You'd never think about commuting, whereas now people, of course, will live on the south coast of Brighton and commute to work in London. Don't think anything about it. The war did a lot of good in many respects, a tremendous amount of harm in others, but it did open people's eyes. It certainly broadened the outlook of what were and would have been the working classes. There's no doubt about it whatsoever. It made people aspire to want more. And you've only got to look at some of the pre-war houses in my own district, where they haven't to drive, they haven't a garage, they haven't space for a garage, and yet you go past and every single house has a car, and in some cases 2. And you can see that in this street and this street alone, even though most of them have drives. In many cases, there's not enough room on the drives. I think the ones across from you particularly, where it's like Earl's Court.
It's a very human world, and I'm a very human being. I try so hard to play my card, but there's no guaranteeing. And it's a very human world, and I'm a very human being. I'm not sure what it's for, what it is, believe in what I'm seeing. Life is full of love, and so much of it confusing. We're all so proud of winning, and we're all so scared of losing. There's always something you can give, something you can share, something new that's only you, so precious and so rare. It's a very human world, and I'm a very human being. I try so hard to play my card, but there's no guaranteeing. And it's a very human world, and I'm a very human being. I'm not sure what it's for, what it is, believe in what I'm seeing. Life is full of time, and so much of it is fleeting. Chances that we're missing, and the challenges we're meeting. There's always something you can give, something you can share, something new that's only you, so precious and so rare. It's a very human